Next, from the Illinois Channel Archives, we offer an encore presentation of author David McCullough talking to a Union League Club audience about his book, 1776. The book recounts the Battle of Independence and how American farmers under the leadership of George Washington managed to defeat the British Army, the greatest military power of the time. This runs about 50 minutes.
You know, when you hear you've won the Pulitzer Prize, it's not like those commercials for Publishers Clearinghouse. What happens is the phone rings in the middle of what seems to be a routine day, and the voice on the other end of the phone is a reporter asking you if you're aware that you've won the Pulitzer Prize. And of course, you say you're not aware of that, and then you're asked how you feel, and you have no idea how you feel because you can't catch your breath. The first call came from a man named Hillel Atali, who writes for the AP. And the next call came from Bob Hoover, who writes for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Pittsburgh is my hometown. And then David Mahegan from the Boston Globe and National Public Radio and NPR, and the phone just kept ringing. Friends heard about it and started calling. And finally, at about 10 of 8, two of our daughters were there to help celebrate their mother's birthday. And about 10 of 8, we sat down to a nice, quiet dinner. And about 10 after 8, the phone rang again, and Rosalie got up to answer, and we heard her say, "Yes. Yes, well, that's right, but I don't know, let me see." And she covered up the phone with her hand and she said, "It's Christine Maxwell from the Christian Science Monitor. Are you willing to speak to her?" And I said, "Sure." So I got up and walked into the living room and picked up the other phone, said hello, and she said, "Mr. McCullough?" I said, "Yes." She said, "This is Christine Maxwell from the Christian Science Monitor." I said, "Yes." She said, "I wonder if you're aware of our special 23-week trial subscription." At the table here this afternoon, one of the people across the table asked me what was the biggest surprise of anything I found in the course of my research. And I hadn't been asked that. And I thought a minute, and I think it's the fact that George III was such an accomplished artist. He really was very good, and his paintings have been hanging in the last year or so in the Queen's Gallery at Buckingham Palace. And looking around this club, all these marvelous paintings, what a collection, and what a pleasure to be in such an atmosphere. I also was surprised by the fact that we have no paintings and or drawings of the soldiers who marched with Washington, other than what was done well after the fact by people like John Trumbull and Charles Wilson Peale, but done usually in a very formal and almost European manner. Trumbull's paintings, which are the ones we know best, are really like magnificently rendered tableaus. They show no dirt or grime or blood or suffering. And the faces of those people all look very handsome and presentable. But life in the 18th century was much harder than we know, much harder than we live. We are no fault of our own, and probably we should all be very grateful for it. We are softies. We are coddled compared to how they live. Just getting through a day in the 18th century was extremely difficult. Inconvenient by our standards, uncomfortable, and full of fear, full of dread of epidemic disease or the death of a child or the everyday accidents, hardships, and hard work of the 18th century. We see portrayals of what was going on at Independence Hall in Philadelphia that summer of 1776. Or perhaps we've seen the old Broadway musical, 1776, and everybody's in their ruffled shirts and their powdered hair and the satin breeches and the rest. And they don't look quite real. They look like they're dressed up for a costume pageant. But the people who were out fighting the war, the people who were going to do the job that made the eloquence, the high ideals, the noble sentiments of the Declaration of Independence mean something more than just a declaration, something more than just words on paper. Those people didn't look much like that at all. They'd been beat up by life, childhood injuries, disease that left its marks. There were no dentists, no orthodontists. It was afflictions of various kinds, couldn't be simply fixed. No plastic surgeons, no medicine much of any kind by our standards. But they were vivid. They were vivid. How do we know? It's interesting how we know. We know from the deserter notices. They would post deserter notices, and there were thousands of deserters. Don't get the idea that everybody fighting in the Revolutionary War under George Washington was a hero. They went home by the hundreds, by the thousands, sometimes because their enlistments were up, but more often it was just a desert, or in fact a defect to the enemy, over to the other side. The heroes are the ones who stayed the course. The heroes are the ones that kept going no matter what. But these deserter notices were posted at general stores, and they were often posted in the papers, the newspapers at the time. And I want to just read you a couple of examples, because this, while we don't have paintings of them or drawings, we do have these wonderful descriptive passages. One George Reynolds of Rhode Island, for an example, was 5 feet 9.5 tall, age 17, and carried his head something on his right shoulder. Thomas Williams was an immigrant, an old country man, meaning not an old man coming out of the country, but a man from the old country, which most likely meant Ireland, Scotland, or possibly England, who spoke good English and had a film in his left eye. David Relf, a saucy fellow, was wearing a white coat, jacket and breeches, and ruffled shirt when last seen. Don't imagine any of these people in uniforms, except a few of the officers. And even then, their uniforms were often nothing more than perhaps a jacket left over from the French and Indian War. Deserted from Colonel Brewster's regiment and Captain Harvey's company, said a notice in the Essex, Connecticut Gazette. One Simeon Smith of Greenfield, a joiner by trade, a thin, spared fellow, about 5 feet 4 inches high, had on a blue coat and a black vest, a metal button on his hat, black long hair, black eyes, his voice in the hermaphroditic fashion, the masculine rather predominant. Likewise, Matthias Smith, a small, smart fellow, a saddler by trade, gray-headed, has a younger look in his face, is apt to say, I swear, and between his words will spit smart. Had on a green coat and an old red greatcoat. He is a right gamester, although he wears something of a sober look. Likewise, John Davy, a long, hump-shouldered fellow, a shoemaker by trade, drawls his words, and for comfortable says, comfortable. He had on a green coat, thick leather breeches, slim legs, lost some of his foreteeth. Like characters out of Dickens, and they're memorable as a consequence. And they had congregated around Boston after the battles of Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill by the thousands, left their farms, left their trades, and they were all New Englanders. And then about July 3rd, into town, into Cambridge, which was the command post for the siege of Boston, came George Washington, riding on a magnificent horse, dressed in the most beautiful uniform any American had ever seen. George Washington not only believed a leader should act like a leader, but look like one. John Adams once said that Washington was the greatest actor of his age, and there's a lot to that. But he's acting a part that needs to be played to the hilt, he knows. And this theme of the theater the theme of history as a drama, the stage of history, and the role you're cast in is all through what the officers and some of the soldiers in the Continental Army wrote in their letters and diaries. Where does it come from? Well, it comes from their sense of history, but it's not American history because no American history had been written as yet. It comes from classical history, Greek and Roman history, and their ideas of virtue, honor, character are Greek and Roman ideas. Character is a Greek word, meaning the stamp. It's the stamp of character. And Washington tries as best he can, as many of them do, to live up to that ideal. So when you're trying to understand these people, you have to, as is true of any people in any time past, you have to try and understand as best you can the culture in which they live. They don't see things as we do. Life is different. It is more real in a way and intense. Death is not something that's put aside, not something that's spoken of only in whispers. You don't see it. I don't think there was a single soldier that served in the American Army in the Revolutionary War, irrespective of age, young as many of them were, that hadn't seen, before he joined up, who hadn't seen someone die. That wasn't new to them. Nor was hardship, nor was the bitterness of working, doing what you had to do outdoors, since most of them came from farms. Farmers and soldiers have to know about weather, and farmers and soldiers know that the weather can often decide the difference between victory and defeat. Farmers are very used to failure, because about half of what they did failed. And this was true whether you were George Washington on a great plantation in Virginia or somebody living on a rocky farm in Massachusetts or Connecticut. Very important to understand. And while these men did not know much about the military, they knew how to do things. They knew how to mend a pair of shoes. They knew how to dig up a stump or build a barracks or get things done with their hands. They did know how to do that. Washington thought they were the worst people he'd ever seen in his life, these New Englanders. He thought they were dirty, rude, unruly, and they had this intolerable idea that they could decide things for themselves. They wanted to elect their own officers. They wouldn't serve unless they elected their own officers. Well, very often, one of the ways an officer got elected to be an officer was that he didn't pay much attention to rules, didn't insist much on rules and regulations, or punish people who violated the rules and regulations. Well, you can't run an army that way, and Washington saw it immediately. He was a very human being, George Washington. And he should never be seen as the marble man or some kind of a demigod. He had his failings, and he had his extraordinary strengths. He was not the great old founding father that we see in the Gilbert Stuart paintings with the white hair, the powdered hair, and the awkward teeth. He was 43 years old when he took command of the Continental Army. Young man. They were all young. They were all young. This is a young man's, young woman's cause, the glorious cause of America. And he had never commanded an army in battle in his life. He was chosen by the Continental Congress to take command because the people in the Continental Congress knew him. They knew the kind of man he was. They knew him as one of them, a member of the legislature, whether in Virginia or the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. They were picking him because they knew the kind of man he was. And they liked him. And they trusted him. Trusted him. Trust is something that's not prevalent enough in our time. And in that day and age, it meant more. They trusted him to do the right thing. And no Congress ever made a better decision than that Congress did in putting George Washington in command. He himself thought he was not adequate for the job. But he also knew that no one was adequate for the job. He himself also was the only member of Congress who showed up in a resplendent uniform, making it pretty clear that he was available. He was modest, but he was also ambitious. Ambitious in the best kind of way. Ambitious to excel in the service of his country. Ambitious to excel in the service of his country. And in 1776, which is truly the most important year in the most important conflict in our history, he failed very badly several times in the earliest part of the year, to the point that if that war had been covered by present-day media, that would have been it. He would have been out of the job, because the whole country would have been appalled at the blunders that he was responsible for. But it started off in a very dazzling fashion. It was as if this pathetic little football team playing Notre Dame had scored the first time they got the ball with a 75-yard run. What happened was so unbelievable that when you read about it, it's like the stuff of fable or myth. You think it couldn't possibly really have been like that. But you examine it, and it is true. A very young officer who knew nothing about the military except what he'd read in books, Henry Knox, 25 years old, gave Washington an idea that they could go to the fort at Ticonderoga in upstate New York and bring back the guns that were there, the cannon that were there. And they could haul those cannon nearly 300 miles down the Hudson Valley, over the Berkshire Mountains in western Massachusetts, all the way to Boston. And they could do it in the dead of winter. Well, to everyone it seemed preposterous, almost ridiculous. Washington not only liked this young man, he liked the idea, and he said, all right, let's do it, you're in charge. And he succeeded. And it's very interesting to study this story, because what it shows is that he succeeded by making the problem the answer to the problem. The problem was it was winter. The answer to the problem, to the task, was haul the guns on sleds, build giant sleds or sledges, and haul it overland with oxen. Everything that could have gone wrong went wrong, including there was a sudden thaw when there was no snow. Then came in a providential blizzard, which made the rest of the progress possible. And eventually, that young man, through pure grit, because his teamsters kept wanting to quit over and over again because it was so dangerous, so terrifying, bringing those cannon down the steep hills of western Massachusetts, that they went on strike. And he'd sit there and talk to them, and talk to them, and talk to them, hours at a time. Finally, they get going again. Had tremendous powers of persuasion, tremendous capacity for leadership, though he'd never done anything like it before in his life. He'd been a Boston bookseller, big, fat, garrulous fellow, one of the most remarkable men I've ever read about. They got the guns from Ticonderoga to Boston, and in one night, with massive manpower, oxen, everything, they put the guns on top of Dorchester Heights. Unbelievable. Again, it's this capacity to work, this capacity to do whatever needs to be done in the way of building or cutting down trees or creating this or that. Not marching, not drilling, not the usual thing of soldiers. They got it they got the guns up on top of Dorchester Heights in one night, which meant that the British would have to leave because these guns were looking right down at their fleet. And the British commanders, General William Howe, looked up that next morning and said, those fellows have done in one night what my army couldn't do in 3 months. They had to leave. They sailed away, taking over 1,000 loyalists, which is a whole other story that I think people ought to know more about. Who were these loyalists, and what did they believe? And why were they fleeing, in a desperate exodus? So I've tried to tell their story as well. But when the British returned, they came back with a vengeance, with a fleet of 400 ships. No such armada had ever been seen anywhere in the world in the 18th century, or ever before. No Englishman had ever seen such an armada. And they sailed into New York Harbor at the end of June, first part of July, and landed 32,000 troops on Staten Island. 32,000 troops was a force larger than the entire population of the biggest city in our country, Philadelphia, which then had a population of about 30,000. And what followed was the Battle of Brooklyn. If there were any justice, Brooklyn would be an open park like Gettysburg, where we would go to study this battle. But instead, of course, it's a city. It's a modern city. But if you walk around the streets of Brooklyn, most every time you go anywhere, you're walking on hallowed ground. It was one of the worst defeats in our history. Nathaniel Greene, who was one of the best of Washington's generals, had taken ill. They were all taking ill all the time, except Washington. One of his great virtues was he was always well. He was healthy, no matter what. We lost far more people in the war from disease than we did from musket fire or cannon fire. And with Greene out of the picture, the whole thing just kind of went wrong, and it was Washington's fault. We were outflanked, outnumbered, outfought, outsmarted. Everything the British did, they did right. Everything we did wrong, with few exceptions. It was a huge battle, 40,000 people, stretched over 6 miles. And after it was over, and we had lost over 1,000 people taken captive, somewhere between 300 and 400 killed, 3 generals captured, shambles, utter disaster. We retreated back to what's now Brooklyn Heights. And for all intents and purposes, we were trapped and the war was over. There was no way to get out except to cross the river. And all it was needed for the British was to have the wind turn, because the wind had been out of the northeast, and they could bring their ships right up into the East River and there'd be no escape. Well, what happened was so incredible that people still find it hard to believe. I find it hard to believe. I can't believe we won the war. Really. And the more you read about it, the more you will say it's just a miracle. It could have gone either way several times, half dozen times in this one year. But the escape from Brooklyn is the most miraculous thing of all. The northeast wind that was keeping the British from bringing up their fleet was also keeping our little makeshift armada of small boats they rounded up over New York side from getting across the river. The intention was to flee, to get out at night. Now, an organized retreat in the face of an overwhelming enemy force is the hardest of all military maneuvers. And even for a trained professional army to do this is very unlikely. This shattered army, men who'd been defeated, wasn't just those people who'd been killed, they were all the wounded and the people who were suffering, and they were sleepless, did it. They went down to the river to start across, and the river was so rough because of the northeast wind that they couldn't cross. And then all of a sudden, like the parting of the Red Sea or something, the wind dropped, wind died, and they could make it. So they started across, one boat after another, back and forth all night long, taking everybody, equipment, horses, everything off. And even with all the effectiveness with which this was done, all in the dark, remember, by the time daylight was about to come, only maybe 3/4 of them had been taken off. There were probably 3,000 to 4,000 people still waiting to be taken off. And if daylight came, the British saw what was happening, they would come down and annihilate them all. Just at that point, in came a providential fog, which covered the entire shoreline of Brooklyn. Very thick fog, covered the whole operation as well as had the night. And yet over on the New York side, which is only a mile across the water, there was no fog at all. They took 9,000 men out of there. The Dunkirk of the Revolution, 9,000 men, all their equipment, horses, cannon, everything, without the loss of a single man. And the water, the gunnels, the boats were so loaded that the water was only about 3 inches below the gunnels. After that came another defeat, Kip's Bay, slaughter. Our people ran like rabbits, but they were mostly all very green Connecticut troops, some of whom had been in the ranks 2 days, some of whom had been given hoe handles with a scythe lashed to it as their weapon. And Washington lost it on that battlefield. He just came apart. He saw everybody running there, throwing their knapsacks down, dropping their muskets fast as they could go with the oncoming enemy. This is about where 34th Street is in New York today. And he plunged in among them, trying to turn them around, to get them to fight. And he started using his riding crop on them, and he pulled his pistol on several officers. And it was only, and he was getting very close up to the enemy lines, where he could have been shot or taken captive easily. And it was only when two of his aides grabbed the bridle and pulled him off that he retired from the field. Then came very bad decisions on his part and the surrender of Fort Washington, which is a whole other story, and a sad story for us, and a very poor mark, if you want to see it that way, for General George Washington. But George Washington never failed to learn from his mistakes. He knew failure was part of life. He knew that you had to go with the current and that you have another chance. He would not give up. He wasn't a great intellectual like Adams or Jefferson. He wasn't a magnetic, spellbinding orator like Patrick Henry. He wasn't Napoleon. He wasn't a brilliant tactician or strategist. He was a leader. Men would follow him through hell. And they did. And we are all their beneficiaries. So when we celebrate the 4th of July, when we talk about the miracle of the Declaration of Independence and all that it professes and all that we hold to be our faith as a democracy, we must never, ever forget these people who did what they did to make that something that would matter. The first true Republican government. First time a people had ever revolted successfully against the mother country. None of whom had ever created a nation before. None of whom was a trained revolutionary from some other part of the country, part of the world. And it was the longest war in our history, except for Vietnam. And it wasn't beautiful gentlemen of the 18th century in beautiful 18th century costume. Soldiers very often in rags, very often with no shoes. The legendary stories about leaving bloody footprints in the snow at Trenton and other places are all true. They were hungry, they were starving, and they were down by the end of the year to 3,000. That's all the Army consisted of. 3,000 men, upon whom everything depended. But they also knew that everything depended on them. The war was over and we'd lost in late December. So Washington and these brave patriots did what you sometimes have to do when all hope's lost. They attacked. Crossed the Delaware, famously, marched 9 miles through the night to strike at Trenton. And as difficult as the crossing was, and just because it's sort of a cliche, we should never think of it as that. And it wasn't just there were big ice cakes in the river, there was a howling northeaster, once again, blinding snow, sleet, hail, and bitterly cold. So cold that on the 9-mile march, which was the hell of the night, not the crossing, 2 men froze to death on the march. And they struck at Trenton in the early morning, attacking out of a blizzard, driving snow, vicious house-to-house fighting, and it was all over very quickly, less than half an hour. And we won. Finally, we won. Now, it wasn't a military victory that changed everything from a military point of view. It was a moral or morale victory, and it transformed how the country felt about the war, and thus transformed the war, transformed the history of our country, and transformed the history of the world. And it's only 229 years ago, which, as the big clock of history goes, wasn't very long ago at all. They're still with us, or should be. I feel very strongly that there's an expression we all use that we shouldn't use. We ought to just drop it. The self-made man, the self-made woman. Nobody's self-made. All of us have been, whatever our station or whatever we've achieved in our respective lines of work, we're all the result of those who've helped us, guided us, inspired us, corrected us. Parents, teachers, friends, but also people we never knew. People who wrote the symphonies that move us to our soul, the people who painted these pictures, the people who wrote the books we love, and the people who did what they did to create the blessings we enjoy. We live in a very interesting country with an extremely interesting history. Thomas Paine said we have the chance to make the world anew. They meant it, and they did. All that they did was not perfect. They weren't perfect. And they knew that what they'd done wasn't perfect. The Declaration of Independence nicely dodges the great Andreas fault in our ideology, slavery. Putting it off till later. We'll solve that later. Let's do this for now. And even with the Civil War, it wasn't entirely resolved. All men created equal. Equal justice before the law. All of these things. And our advantage is that we have to carry on with that ideal. They haven't handed us a perfect piece of machinery that works beautifully and will forever. That's our advantage. That's our strength. We are always, and I hope always will be, a work in progress. Thank you. If you have some questions, I would like to see if I can answer them. Yes, way in the back.
The idea to attack Trenton out of Washington himself?
Was the idea to attack Trenton Washington's own? Absolutely. Washington always wanted to attack. And fortunately, early in the war, his generals kept talking him out of it when it wasn't the right thing to do. But when they got to the western side of the Delaware in Pennsylvania, and they knew it was really over. They were desperate. It was all or nothing. It was a last throw of the dice, and they won. And it was the audacity of it, because nobody attacked in the midst of a blizzard. Nobody came out of the night and out of a blizzard to attack a force that presumably was superior. And by the way, the Hessians weren't drunk at Trenton, as is commonly said. They're often described as either drunk or hungover from the Germanic celebration of Christmas the day before. Not true. They were asleep, but they weren't inebriated. Yes, sir.
20 years before the Revolutionary War, Washington was in the French and Indian War. What influence did that have on his experience in the Revolutionary War?
Thank you. What influence did Washington's experience in the French and Indian War have on his command? Well, Washington was a man who apparently had no fear whatsoever, physical fear. Cannon, musket ball, nothing. Bullets flying all around. Didn't bother him in the slightest. And courage is contagious, just as terror is contagious. And that quality he had a big effect on his troops. French and Indian warfare that Washington fought in was mostly all wilderness warfare, which is very different from the kind of fight he would have to fight in the eastern part of the country where the wilderness was no more. And he had no experience whatever in fighting what sort of the pitched, formalized battles of the 18th century. And it took him a while to catch on that if he came out and faced these English regulars, professional troops, who, by the way, were extremely courageous themselves, and they weren't commanded by aristocratic pinheads who didn't know what they were doing, is another misconception. It took him a while to figure out that you can't fight them that way, and to figure out that the point isn't to protect cities or hold New York or hold New Jersey. The point is to keep the army alive and fighting. And it also took the British a while to figure that out, that the way to defeat these rebels was to get the army. Forget about taking Philadelphia or New York or whatever. Just go get that army and kill it. Put it out of business. One of their generals, Henry Clinton, saw this quite early, and if he had been given the command, if he had been made commander-in-chief instead of William Howe, I think the war might have gone quite differently. The British also only gave, the generals in the British Army were all aristocrats. You had to be an aristocrat to be a general. And there was a captain named Montresor, John Montresor. If he'd been in command, we wouldn't have had much of a chance. He was really good. And it was there where the system was keeping talent from getting to the top. Whereas in our system, this very lowly lieutenant or captain of artillery, Henry Knox, could get his idea about Ticonderoga right to the top immediately. So it wasn't just opportunity for the individual, it was opportunity for ideas, which is still a big part of why we are the way we are. Yes?
One of the things you mentioned in your book is the fact that because Washington had so much, and had so much to
Yes,
lose,
yeah.
that was very influential in
Yes.
his position as a leader. But given the fact that he had so much to lose, why do you think he was willing to put all that at risk?
The question is, which is an extremely interesting point, the men in the ranks who were mostly farmers and looked like farmers in from the field were willing to follow Washington very often because he was so rich. Now you'd think today, why would that be, you know? Well, because their reasoning was if a man that had all that he had in the way of possessions, land, prominence, was willing to risk it all for the cause, who were they to hold back? And then the question is, why would he risk it? Because he believed it, because he knew that we had the chance to do something new and exciting and good for all mankind here. They really did believe that. And they say it often. And they say that they're willing to die for it, and many of them did. Washington's burden were the worries. He was worried all the time. He's sleepless half the time. I think one of the reasons he failed so badly at Fort Washington, he was indecisive is really what he did. I think he was suffering from insomnia. I think sleep deprivation. But he had a lot to be sleepless about. Yes?
As a historian, what is your thought on the current problem in the U.S. Senate with the cloture rule?
As a historian, what is my thought on the problem with the U.S. Senate on the cloture rule? Could I be invited back? Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Regarding the statement that the way Washington blundered and all, and the way the media of today may have portrayed the media not to take the steps that he did, can you comment a little on your feeling of what the media's role in our perception of what goes on in government and all?
The media role in our perception of what goes on. You have to be very careful about comparing times long ago with times today. Then was then and now is now. The steadiness, the clamor of the media now. Every day is a crisis. Every day someone is exposed for having said something ridiculous or done something egregious. It isn't just that they paint everybody in public life warts and all. They paint people in public life as if they were all warts. There's not, and the more I know of, and in a way this is an answer to your question, there was a great excitement a few weeks ago about the independent judiciary. The independent judiciary is under threat. Well, the independent judiciary might be under threat, but we're not going to get rid of the independent judiciary. That's not going to happen. That's part of the very basis of everything we have. That's in the Constitution. That's in our whole notion of justice. Just as we're not going to lose our nerve or lose our capacity for giving people a second chance just because things aren't going right. What I worry about is that the media so amplifies whenever anything's going wrong, people tend to panic. They tend to forget, look, pendulums swing. That's what pendulums do. And we've been through much worse before. Rancor in politics today. Yes, indeed. Good heavens. In the first Congress, they went at each other with fire tongs from the fireplace. Harry Truman said the only new thing in the world is the history you don't know. And what history does is it gives you a sense of balance, a sense of understanding, see things in perspective, to see things with some maturity. People who walk around, and alas, this is a whole other subject. We're raising a generation of young Americans, several generations of young Americans, who are historically illiterate. I can't overemphasize that. I'm with them a lot in colleges and universities. Not their faults, but what they don't know about sort of the elementary things of our history is staggering. And if that goes on much longer, we could be in the soup. This is dangerous. And again, if you invite me back, I'll talk about that another time. But let me take your question right there. Yes, please.
Now that we have all this historical perspective, what do you think of George III?
Now that we have all the, what do I think of George III? We'll end with George III. George III was a young man. Again, I emphasize, everybody's young. He was in his 30s. He was a very gifted musician. He played both the harpsichord and the violin. Samuel Johnson, who was no light critic, said that he found George III to be one of the most interesting conversationalists that he'd ever met. He was an artist. He assembled the finest private library in the world at the time. And he started the National Academy of the Arts, among other things. He was a great collector of astronomical instruments. He was very interested in astronomy. He was an 18th century polymath. And he thought he was doing his duty. And so did the country. Now, we had Edmund Burke and James Fox and others speaking eloquently in the Parliament, trying to get people to understand the position of the Americans. But even they, in their spectacular speeches, would refer to us as our colonies. They weren't about to give up our colonies any more than George III was. The country was behind the king, the Parliament, he had the votes in Parliament, and he thought he was doing his duty. His mother said, "George, be king." And when your mother says that, and you're the king, you're king. I'd love to spend a couple of hours with George III. He's remembered as the crazy king who lost the colonies. Well, he wasn't crazy. His mental illness didn't come on until 20 years later, and it was a disease, porphyria, which wasn't even diagnosed until the 20th century. He had a terrible end to his life in madness. Today, I think it probably could be taken care of with medication. If you saw the play, The Madness of King George III, it's a very, very good representation. I think it's one of the best that Hollywood's yet done with history. Now, we're at the end, aren't we? I want to end by telling you two pieces of what I think are very good news. One is that, first is that Tom Hanks, who I think has done superb work in the films he's produced about history, is doing an 11-hour miniseries for HBO on my book, John Adams. Yeah. Thank you. And it's under production now in Virginia. They're building a whole back lot outside of Richmond, and they're going to be shooting a lot of it in Williamsburg. And the second piece of good news, is that Tom Hanks has decided to do the same thing with 1776. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois. If you have any comments or questions on our programming, please email us at illinoischannel@aol.com. Or if you have any questions about the Illinois Channel, please visit our website at www.illinoischannel.org.